I would love to start with a question. I hope that something resonated with you from the keynote yesterday. I was telling Nick and Chris, I really struggled to figure out what part of my work to focus on in 30 minutes. But I felt like with all of the changes that are happening in our news and in our country and in our world right now, it just felt like focusing on how important it is to read the world with our kids who are experiencing the same world. But oftentimes schools forget that kids are experiencing that same world, how to process it and how to make it a part of our actual curriculum and how to make it something that they can process, so they're not trying to figure that out when it's high stakes and they're actually in the world as voters and as citizens who are making choices. So how do we include kids and how do we make that a part of our everyday curriculum? I think was what I felt was the most important thing to talk about right now, as we try to figure out even who our next president's going to be.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I would love to start with some questions from the participants, if there are any.
And I think while we're waiting for that,
Mhm.
the way that it worked yesterday is I was able to invoke my MC privilege and maybe get the conversation seated. Oh my gosh, Mason, almost the winner of Analogia yesterday, nearly the unseated Mr. Chris McNutt here. Go ahead, Mason. What do you got?
So thank you so much for your keynote speech. There were so many ideas in there that I want to try and like incorporate into my teaching. But one of the questions that you posed in the keynote that I was really interested by was something you just alluded to, which is how do we teach students to read and question the world? And so I'm a middle school science teacher. That's kind of the context I'm coming from. But what are some practices you've used that have been effective at teaching students to use the world as like a text or a curriculum when you're teaching them?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking. I think that it's modeling that, right? Like, what does it look like? And putting it in front of students, texts and videos and news clips, and even like Saturday Night Live clips, like things like that, that are what are happening in the world currently. And it requires you to shape a curriculum that's flexible, right? Because what happens in a lot of schools is that they write these curriculum or curricula in advance, and then they deliver it because and I think, um, I watch some of the teachers that I've worked with in the last 10 years, and it's the same curriculum that I studied when I was a student 100 years ago. And so like just thinking about how little curriculum has shifted, even though our entire world has shifted, is a big part of the problem. So how do we create curriculum that is flexible enough to really incorporate the world as it is? And so we have some anchor texts that are really rooted in ideas like epistemology and identity and those kinds of things. And then when things happen, then we're bringing in the curriculum. So when Amanda Gorman delivered her poem on the inauguration day, I took that, I brought it in the next day, and we're like, let's read this. Let's talk about why this is so relevant today, right? And so we practiced that over and over again in the first 2, 3 months of school, where as things were happening, they became part of our conversation, even if it was like the icebreaker in the beginning. Hey, you guys, here, watch this clip. Let's talk about what's happening and let's process it together. My classroom is set up in a circle to invite the conversation all the time. And that's a really big thing. There are no desks in the middle. We literally are sitting in chairs in a circle, and I sit among my students, and I will oftentimes at the beginning of the year initiate the conversation and model what that looks like in order for the kids to get used to like like how do we talk about these things. And one of my students told me one year, she said, Dr. J, we are often told that we have to have conversations, critical conversations, but nobody's ever actually taught us how to have a conversation. And that made me stop in my tracks. If we just listen to the kids, we become so much better at what we do. And I thought, okay, I need to be more intentional about modeling and teaching them and highlighting like great response. This is how we respond, because there are going to be very different opinions in classrooms where you're talking about what's happening in the world, whether it's global warming, animal rights, or social justice issues, right? Regardless of what we're talking about. And we have to teach kids how to disagree and still be in community and respect. And so that was one of the very big things at the beginning of the year, where like if I disagreed with something or if students disagreed with something, that we were highlighting good practices and things that we could do better. And then by the middle of the year, when Roe versus Wade happened, my students were like, Dr. J, can we not do what we have planned today? Can we talk about what just happened? And can we come up with an action plan? Because I always ask my students, now that we know, what are we going to do with what we know? And so none of our conversations literally just sit in conversation, but the kids are constantly thinking about like, what can I do to raise awareness? How can I like teach my peers? How can I go home and have this conversation with my parents? And that little 45-minute conversation of us processing the impacts of Roe versus Wade being overturned turned into a teaching in our classroom, in our lunchroom, like lunchtime, in like the lunch space for other students to also learn what the impacts of that were. And that all came from kids. And so I think modeling it, making it a normal practice, like showing kids that it's important enough for us to stop everything and process and talk about why this is important, bringing in the conversation initially and not being so tied to like, I will play devil's advocate. I will allow kids to kind of think about all of the arguments that are happening there. And kids are bold and they're fearless. And even the most resistant kids to the conversations, like I had a student whose name was Max, and he was an informal leader. And this was 3 years ago. He was an informal leader, and he was so resistant to the conversation. He was a young Polish man who came from a family where his parents were immigrants and they had to work really hard for everything. And so the idea of like privilege was it was difficult for him to understand because they struggled to have everything, and the whole family worked, including him. And socioeconomically, it was very difficult for them to survive post COVID. And so every time we talked about privilege, he shut down. And I do a day of equity conference where I invite speakers for kids to talk about systems of oppression, and they're all professionals in their field, and they talk about how systems of oppression are built into their field and how they disrupt, how they became like, because I by junior year, we're teaching kids like activism is not just going to Capitol Hill, it's not just voting. Activism is reclaiming your narrative. Activism is thinking about how you can disrupt in your field because oppression exists everywhere. And so this is like, how can I marry my passion to my work? And so these professionals come in and talk. And by the end of that day, Max's journal reflection was, I get it now. And so he became an informal leader, pushing the word and getting a lot of kids to kind of buy into the work. And I found that working with kids is so much more powerful than working with adults because they're willing to take risks and they're willing to speak up and they're willing to challenge. Like that's their developmental age, and they're just more flexible they haven't been grounded in what these ideas for 45 years and immersed in them. And so you're really working against a lot less, and they're really much more willing. And so I've seen a lot more impact with students. And so I think it's just normalizing it and modeling it. I think that's the answer to the question, and giving kids the tools to engage with because it's heavy. And a lot of that I've learned too with time is that we have to like make it hopeful. Like you can change it. It's not just like this is the state of our world, because for a lot of kids that can be very defeating and heavy. And so it's also about like, but here's how we can change it, and celebrating the changes and the things that they do one student at a time, one human at a time, one project at a time. Bringing the joy back into our classrooms has to be a part of this work, because I think we've lost the joy in so much of our work as a field. And so it's the joy of doing it with kids, but it's also the joy of kids engaging in this work and realizing like the message that I have is not our world is broken, we need to fix it, but you're so powerful and you can do whatever you want and you can decide what what your path and your space in this world is going to look like. That's my message to them. And I think that's a lot different. The toning of that is very different. And kids' feelings when they walk into your space is different. And their willingness to engage and take risks then becomes very different as well.
I wonder, as a follow-up to this, it both echoes Mason's question and then also gets to what Mal was mentioning in the chat here. But kind of focusing at that practical level, what does? Because I imagine walking into that space, it's more seminar style. This might be a lot different from what students are used to. What are those first couple days of onboarding above and beyond that modeling that you had mentioned? What does that onboarding process look like for kids who might not be used to this kind of context? How do you get students sharing? How do you get them comfortable in that space? How do you get kids on board with what I imagine is a very different experience than the rest of their schooling?
Yeah, again, another great question. I think So you're never going to have all kids participating. Some kids, some adults, like you can sit in sessions like this all day long, and some people will never feel comfortable unmuting and asking a question, but they feel comfortable chatting, right? So I think it's about giving kids multiple modes. But I always tell my teachers, I'm a department chair. I lead a team of 25 teachers. The first thing that I always say is, we're not teaching the first 2 weeks of school. We're going to take the first 2 weeks of school model, but instead of like inculcating rules and processes, we're just going to get to know kids. We're going to love them. We're going to make sure that by the end of week 2, they know that this space says to them, I love you. Bring your whole self into this space. You matter. Everything that you, every part of you, if you speak a different language, and this is an English classroom, bring your language into this classroom. If you have a culture, I don't want you to leave. Like, that sense of double consciousness is what keeps a lot of kids in their head rather than in the space all the time, right? Like, you're not bringing your whole self into the door. What pieces of myself are acceptable? What pieces of myself are not acceptable? And so the message of the first 2 weeks of school is, all of you is wanted here. We want you, your entirety, your whole self in here. And so I always revert back to Shane Saphir and Jamila Dugan from Street Data. And that is a book that if you have not read it, I recommend that everybody picks it up and reads it, because I think it is the most relevant uh, equity text, education text that every teacher should read today, every educator should read. And so they talk about this concept of holism, and how if we're not really dealing with and addressing all 4 parts of a student, spiritually, academically, physically, like every part of that student, socially, emotionally, then we are not addressing the student, and they're never going to be successful. And so it's the 4 quadrants of a student that we're really targeting in that first 2 weeks of school. The other part of that answer too, Nick, is making sure that we are giving students different spaces to process, right? Because just like adults, kids are in different spaces of their journey. They have different comfortabilities. They have different ways of expressing themselves. They have different modes of learning and expression. And so one of the things that I've learned, I attended an IRL conference a few years ago during COVID, and it was a equity conference. It was mostly like for beginners kind of in the conversation, but there were people at different levels in that space. And because it was virtual, we were on the screen for a lot of it together. And there was one Black attendee in the conference, a male, and everybody else was from different backgrounds, but there was a lot of anti-Blackness in one of the session conversations, and people were trying to process their anti-Blackness and how it existed in different cultures. And by the end of the session, the man was in tears. And he unmuted himself and he said, it was very difficult for me as an adult to listen to these conversations. And that stopped me in my tracks, because I was thinking to myself, like, I have these conversations with kids all the time in the classroom, and some of them are very intense. And I have never thought about like the impact that processing this conversation can have with kids whose lived experience we're processing, right? And so I learned in that moment that we needed to give kids a space to process, like, privately. And so this is where Google Docs came in so handy, because then I started virtual journals where my students journal all the time. And one of the norms that we have is, like, if you feel like what you're going to say could be harmful to someone else, I don't want you to hold that back, because that's the learning opportunity, right? Like, that's my place to probe and push. And I want to know where you are in your journey, but let's process that privately between us. And so we do dialogic journals where we talk back and forth. I talk back and forth to the kids in their journals, and I'll share experiences and stories to help probe their thinking, and resources and links to videos and things to help them process before they process out loud, so that we're not harming each other. And if harm happens publicly, my rule is that it needs to be addressed publicly within the norms of our classroom, so that people can understand, like, what do we need to be thinking about when we say something like this, and how do we process that? That doesn't mean that it's a perfect system. And it's not something that you can really plan for, and you're going to make mistakes. And that's what I tell my teachers all the time. And we normalize that, and we acknowledge to kids that, like, hey, I made a mistake and I apologize, because you're modeling the behaviors of community, and you're modeling the behaviors of conversation, and you're modeling the behaviors of what it means to grow your capacity as a human, because you're a learner in that space, just like the kids are. But I think the answer to that is really normalizing at the beginning of the year and getting kids to know that this is not a safe space. We're going to feel real. And I always say that to the kids, if you're not uncomfortable here, you're not growing. I'm uncomfortable. It's really hard for me to have these conversations. So we're not looking for a safe space. We're looking for a space that's going to make you uncomfortable. This is a brave space where you're going to grow, and you're going to, discomfort means you're growing. And so even to my teachers, like, a lot of my teachers are resistant. I work with teachers who the majority of them can't relate to lived experiences of many marginalized communities. And so getting them to consider and immerse themselves into some of these conversations is very difficult, and balancing that happening in the classroom without the teacher inflicting harm or immersing the ideas that you're trying to kind of disrupt into the classroom is also a very big challenge. But it's about doing that work in a lot of different spaces, and also being very honest with kids and telling them from the beginning of the year, and parents, like, that transparency is key, right? In so much of education, we're often trying to understand what's happening. And I think that communication with, like, my administration, here's what our curriculum is going to look like. Hey, we're reading a text this week, and I want you to know that it's probably going to ruffle feathers with parents or with students or with other teachers, and making sure that they're clear, talking to my teachers and making sure that their transparency is there, talking to the students and making sure that that transparency is there and that our messaging is there. We have clear goals. Our curriculum is clear. Many of our parents don't like it, but this is our curriculum and this is what we're teaching. And we're not offering, like, I've had even administrators come and say, do you want me to get this kid out of this class because the parents are, and I said, no, this is the kid that needs to be in this class, right? Like, Max would have been out of my class if I allowed him, if I said to the administration, yes, get him out, but look, having him in the class got him to really consider the invisible lens. And so doing this work is about the work itself, and it's a lot harder than teaching The Great Gatsby and teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, but the rewards are so much bigger. And I've been doing it for 10 years. And it was funny because I was with my mom last night and she was at a gathering and she was saying, yeah, I've been with my daughter and she gets calls from teachers. And this is my mom, guys. If I tell you, like, culturally, education to Arabs, humanities to Arabs, culturally, and historically is not something that, like, if you fail, you go into humanities. And so if you're not a doctor or an engineer, then you're not really, your degree doesn't really mean much culturally. And so when I decided to be a teacher as the first person to go to college in my family, my entire family, my mom cried, like ugly cried, and didn't talk to me for like weeks. And then today, like 25 years later, she sees that I had students that I taught 10 years ago who are still reaching out to me and saying, your classroom transformed my life. And these are kids who are in Palestinian encampments. These are kids who are starting clubs in colleges and universities. These are kids who are writing and publishing. These are kids who are doctors and they're looking at medical equity, like for people who don't receive good care because of how they identify. They're kids who are transforming their fields in so many different ways. And it was because they had the opportunity to experience, and I was just teaching one class. So they had an opportunity to experience 1 year of what it means to feel that you're empowered versus disempowered, which is what a lot of our education does. It strips kids from their voices. And instead we're saying, I know you have a voice and I want you to use it in this space in the first 2 weeks of school. And then we constantly reinforce that. And that's transformative in and of itself, not just for the school space, but for the identity and the self-concept of these students that sit in that space.
And it's kind of undoubtedly the impact that you're having on kids honestly speaks to how radical the work that you're doing is in the context of schooling, how radically different, how radically important. And I say that to kind of build into Brian's excellent kind of context in his question over here too. And he notes, having worked recently in a Hawaiian culture-based educational setting, how your keynote resonated with him so deeply. And thank you for sharing such deep and profound insights. I love the issues of justice, advocacy, and identity serve as the curriculum for reading and writing. But now living in Ohio, Idaho, sorry, I didn't mean to throw Ohio under the bus, Chris, but Idaho, which has a very different political makeup. So, Sawsan, how would you recommend implementing a justice and identity-based curriculum in a state that's banning books in school libraries and suppressing historically oppressed voices?
You're speaking to my heart. This is the challenge of so many of our schools today. And we were talking, Chris and Nick and I were talking about, like, just the state of the world and how, depending on who our next president is, how much worse and how much more controlled the conversations and the work in schools is going to be. And my, like I said in my keynote, your locus of control, right? Like, systems are constantly blaming teachers, teachers are blaming systems. We need to just think about, like, I'm in front of, if I'm an elementary school teacher, anywhere between 25 and 30 kids every day. If you're a high school teacher, you could be teaching 120 to 240 kids a week. every single day or every other day. So like you're interacting with these students every single day. You can still elevate by having the students bring the conversation in. And it starts with just simple identity questions. Like I've worked in schools where we couldn't even say the word equity. And I remember I taught in a middle school where they had a list of approved books. It took 4 years to get a book approved by the Board of Education. By the time the book was approved, there were so many great new novels coming out. Like we could never teach anything that was relevant or new because of the process. They made it impossible to get books approved. And they had Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And I was like, okay, a BIPOC character, like let's teach this book. At least it'll bring somebody who's a different voice and a different experience into the conversation. And I was called into the office every other day because I was told that I was discriminating against all the white students in the building. But I didn't abandon the book, and I insisted that this was lived experience that was valid and a part of our American history and needed to be taught. But what I learned too is that I got so caught up in fighting for this one text that it wasn't about the work anymore. And so my alternate like response to that was, how do I bring in texts like at the high school level now, Beverly Tatum, The Complexity of Identity, right? Where she talks about the intersectionality of her identity as a Black gay woman, right? And so she talks about her experiences versus like a Black man or a Black woman who isn't part of the LGBTQ plus community, and how that is completely different than her own experience. And at a higher level, sometimes we'll just take an excerpt out of that and say, okay, now how do you identify? Let's talk about your intersectionality. And let's think about the different ways that your intersectionality has been complex. And, you know, kids initially, if they're not used to having these deep conversations, they need to see what that looks like. And so I'll start sharing my own pieces. I'll give a writing prompt, and I'm very vulnerable. I share a lot of myself with my students, and I'll talk about what it means to be an Arab, Muslim, Palestinian woman, and how every intersection of my identity poses different challenges in my current context, and has been my entire life as a student and as a teacher, and now as an administrator, and just as a person in the world, even as a parent. And then kids will understand what you're asking them, and they'll be so quick to share. And so it's all of a sudden the resource becomes, and the richest resource in our classrooms is our kids. It's their lived experiences. It's what they bring in. And when they're able to like, that's why I always talk about like, we want our kids to be content creators versus content consumers, right? If I can't get books approved, my students' stories, that is the most accurate mirror. Like I've walked into classrooms and observed teachers teaching where they're like, I'm going to give you, I teach in a primarily Mexican student school. And my teacher, one of the teachers is like, here, I'm going to give you this Mexican text to teach because it represents your lived experiences. When did one book ever represent an entire group of people, right? Even that thinking, what we think sometimes is culturally responsive, is harmful. I call it well-intentioned harmful impact, right? We think we're doing these wonderful things in the name of equity, but what we're doing is we're just replicating inequitable practices. And it's curriculum violence and spirit murdering happening all day long. So how do we counter that? We counter that when we say, hey, I teach a group of students who identify similarly. I want every single one of you to talk about X, right? A very, like I always say, like one of the things I do with my students in the first 2 weeks of school is give me a micro story or 3 micro stories in a journal entry that are 3 stories that you think you're going to tell your grandkids because they shaped who you are as a human. Just 3. And oftentimes those will be very deep experiences that they're going to share. And I have them just share one of the 3, but I get to read all 3. That is the most accurate mirror of the students that are in front of me, that then becomes a window, right, for other students to learn who the kids in my classroom space are. And that's the best resource and the best text. So I don't need to get a text approved. If I can lean into my students reclaiming their narratives, if I can lean into my students elevating their actual lived experiences. I mean, we've talked about students who are brutalized by police in our classrooms. We've talked about students who were on the border, whose families were separated when we were separating kids from their families. We talked about kids whose families were deported when DACA happened. We talked about all of those things that were happening in the world were the lived experiences of the students that I was teaching. And that by itself became something that we could really bring in. And when those experiences aren't happening in the space because you're teaching in a primarily like one demographic school or homogenous school district, you're able to kind of question and probe and bring kids into like, how do we relate to this? Or how do we relate to that? And you're able to highlight the uniformity between the experiences and the differences and why those differences exist based on identity. And so your kids are the most rich resource in the classroom, and they come in with funds of learning and tons of different learning experiences and lived experiences and culture and language and so much richness that we often erase and is invisible to so many teachers because we're not used to looking for it. And when we can find a way to look for it and elevate it, that becomes your resource. And then it's not you anymore. Nobody's going to push and invalidate a student's lived experience, right? Nobody's going to say that that story is invalid. You don't need approval for that. And that's a part of the natural conversation. So you're still able, like I always say, like as a high school educator, by the time kids get to me in freshman year, they've had 8 or 9 years of education where somebody or people or the systems have been telling them that who you are isn't good enough. The language that you speak needs to stay at home. We're trying to quickly move you from whatever language you speak to speaking English. This is an English classroom, so please only speak in English. Please only write in English. I even tell my students, hey, if your tongue and your heart speak in Spanish, write a poem in Spanish and don't translate it for me. Because you're writing for yourself. You're not writing for me. You're creating for you. You're creating to put your voice out into the world. And so if that is the piece that is speaking to your heart right now, just write, right? Like let's bring the love back to reading and writing. Bring the love back to school. And when that happens, that alone is transformative. You're seeing kids. And like a lot of people are like, well, how do you do that and still teach like rhetoric and like the standards, the content? Like it's not an either or. We're teaching kids rhetoric. Like I always say to the students, what are you passionate about? Like, what do you want to convince your mom of? Let's start there. Every teenager wants to be out later or go out with friends. Like, let's start with like something that everybody can access, an on-ramp. And now let's think about like, what's a world issue? I very heavily in our school curriculum, we incorporate the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And that's kids interact with every single one of the 17 goals by the end of their high school career. And so like, this is not just about social justice, but it's about environmental justice. Like we are soon enough, we're going to be getting refugees from Venezuela because they're running out of water. How many of our kids know that, right? How many of our kids can understand the connectedness between what's happening in Palestine now and the environment, what's happening in Palestine now and so many different things, like our tax dollars funding it, like all of these different things that are happening on a global level that we don't understand intentionally because we're not including that in our curriculum. And so when we can create the connections between all of these things, what does a good schooling look like? What is a good government? Let's think of like if I had a group of people that I got to lead and I got to create a government from scratch, what would be the pillars of that government? What are the rules? Like you're not talking about equity, but you are having equity conversations that are getting kids to really think about their global impact. We're getting kids to think about their role as citizens in the globe, not just in their local context. And you're really getting them to understand, like, I would imagine that if I was a high school student in today's world, I wouldn't even know what to make of what's happening in our presidential election right now. I wouldn't know what to make out of a lot of things that are happening in our world right now. But I know that my students, they can. Right? They know exactly what's going on. They know what questions they need to be asking, and they know what role they need to play for the most part. I don't know if many adults, like, I don't know if I know what role I need to be playing right now, but they have an idea of where they want to see things go and how to navigate because they've become a part of, they've been used to that for the last 4 years. And so I think it's really important for us to think of what the on-ramps are. What is, and it's not, sometimes less is more. Sometimes it's, I always say this is a part of the conversation. It's not the conversation. And so it's about giving kids the toolbox to continue this work on their own. We're not going to give them everything because we're literally preparing kids for a world that we can't even imagine. We don't even know what next year is going to look like. And so it's about giving them the tools to engage with anyone at any time, in any world, in any space, and the ability to ask questions, the ability to, like, now we have AI, the ability to think about, like, how is AI a human-made thing that we can't rely on it to give us, like, non-biased information? What questions do I need to be asking when I'm working with or using AI? What things should I be looking for? How is even this tool that seems so bigger than life even limited in what it can give me as a human being? And especially, like I always say, like, all you have to do is ask AI about Palestine and what's happening in the world today, and you know that it's a man-made bias tool. And so we have to, like, really think about, how do we get kids to ask the right questions? And then how do we teach them where to look for information in multiple different ways in order for them to really find their own truth? Because it's not about them adopting my truth. It's about them understanding how to find their truth in any world, in any situation. And if we can do that, then imagine, like I always say, like, what is the purpose of school? And historically, schools have been places where we want kids to like get a good education so they can get a good job and make money. And that's been our downfall, right? We've become slaves to capitalism. And we need to get to schools and kids to understand that you're much more than a job and a dollar sign. You have impact to decide your trajectory, to change the world, to make a future that's better than the one that we're living in today. Like I think about my grandkids and what kind of a world I want them to be a part of. This isn't it. 100% this isn't it. And we can only plant the seeds, but it's up to the kids that we're teaching in our classrooms today to shape a world that's better than the one that we're living in right now. And I believe that these kids who have lived through COVID, who are like privy to so much information on social media, who understand the Black Lives Matter movement, who understand a lot of these different things, are the ones that are going to make that difference. I believe that, like, at my core, I know this is it.
Josh, we'll get you, and then I'll try to get through the queue of questions in the chat as well.
Thanks, Nick. Dr. J, thank you. I watched your keynote late last night, and I threw in the chat just a second ago a book recommendation, The Good Ancestor by Roman Krznaric, because I loved the references that you made at the end of the keynote about good ancestry. And I'm here in Honolulu, and in Hawaii, ancestry is a huge part of our local culture here. I think my question has to do with how do we have a parallel, or I'm not even sure it is a parallel, I don't know. How do we, in the midst of all of this work, also promote kindness and compassion and humility and quietness? There's so much shouting going on right now. And you know where this question is coming from. I mean, I spent 17 years in the classroom trying to develop the kids' ability to ask questions. But here today, you know, just turned 65 last year. I'm in a state of worry about how angry a lot of the rhetoric is and how much kindness and compassion seems to get shoved off to the side. I wonder if you can just talk about that a little bit. What are your thoughts about that?
I love that question, and I feel like that is really at the core of this work. Nothing moves forward. You can't even think about social justice or equity without understanding and knowing that the foundation of all of this is love. And I sometimes feel like it sounds cliche, right? I call this heart work. This is the heart work because you have to love the world, have the kids, you have to love the profession, you have to love what you do in order for you to show up this way in front of students. It's not just like, it's not, and that's why I felt like I needed to focus on this in half an hour when I
That's
did
a
my
great
keynote.
question.
It's not a lesson plan, right? Like this isn't about engagement. This isn't about it. All of those things come. This isn't about like it's about how do we, like, I start with, and I always bring the students to like to understanding that, you know, I purposely don't teach in districts or work in districts where a lot of kids look like me. That's an intentional decision on my part because I feel like there's so many stigmas around what I stand for, what I mean, who I am post 9/11, before 9/11, like who are Muslims in this world, who are Arabs, and especially today, who are Palestinians. And so like I purposely choose districts where there aren't a lot of Arabs or a lot of Muslims, and that's where I teach because I feel like just by being in that space, I'm dismantling and putting holes and getting kids to question stereotypes that they know to be true every single day just by showing up. I don't have to talk about anything. I just need to show up and I need to love those kids. This is heart work, right? Like so many of our kids just need love because it's a hard world. Like I was talking to Nick and Chris earlier about like how do we get every teacher who's out there trying to do this work to know about your organization? This is a lifeline. I needed this organization earlier in my career when I started doing this work, and I'm the only one in my district who's doing this work. And I was a teacher, my positionality, I needed support, I needed a network, and I didn't have it. And like this network, this PLT feeds you, right? Like we need these spaces for educators too. And I think that there's hard work that's involved in all of this. And I start with the story of Chris Singleton, the baseball player whose mother was shot in the church shootings. He's a Black baseball player, and his mom was shot I don't remember if everybody recalls the 8 women that were shot in a Bible reading. And his mom was one of them. And she was a single parent. Her whole life was raising her boys. She had 3 sons. He was the oldest. He was going to the Major League Baseball to play a baseball player the following year. And he does a keynote and he talks to schools about like he had to leave his career so he could take care of his siblings because his mother was shot for being a Black woman. And he talks about like how we have to validate like and understand lived experiences because he has a very strong stance on gun control. And when he tells people, I hate guns, you know, a lot of people, they don't like that response right away. And so when he explains to them that his mother was killed by a gun, right, then all of a sudden there's an empathy and understanding and love for his situation. Like we understand why Chris Singleton hates guns. You can't expect somebody like him to not have such a strong stance after his lived experience. And so we start with that. And that is to say, like, my religion is oftentimes not something that a lot of my kids can relate to, right? Oftentimes my hijab, I had a student come to me and the first day of school in front of the entire class, my dad says you're a terrorist. And I was like, okay, let's have this conversation. Let's talk about that, right? Like, where do you think that comes from? And again, many of the students that I teach have never really interacted with somebody who looks like me. And so we were able to stop what we were doing and kind of answer questions and get to the conclusion that we fear what we don't understand. And so once we got there, I said, okay, so now that we all agree to this understanding, what questions do you have for me? Ask me anything. And the kids asked questions and I answered all of their questions. And then I said, okay, now go home and talk to your parents. 2 days later, dad called me and said, I'm sorry. I apologize. My son has taught me, you have taught me, we have never interacted with anybody who looks like you. We grew up in homes where that's what we were taught. That transformed that family, right? That's a learning experience. That's what it means to really delve into the community. Let's bring our parents into the conversation, but there's heart work there. So when we talk about foundations in the first few weeks of school, it's also about establishing that in this kind of learning environment, what's going to surface is that we're going to have very different opinions about things. We're going to have different lived experiences. We're going to also have very different values. Like some families and communities are very communal. Others are not. Some are like, how come in communities like Mexican communities and Arab communities, you'll find generations of a family living together? That's often something that's mocked by people that don't understand what that means. But that idea of community and family is very different from culture to culture. And so we normalize and elevate the idea that we're not going to be on the same page a lot of the time, but I can still love you and respect you and be in community with you and listen to you and try to empathize and understand your lived experience and your values, even if I might not agree with them, in order for us to really coexist and be able to do this work as a community. It is a community. It's collaborative learning. And it's also getting them to understand that they're going to exist in spaces with people who are going to come from everywhere and have a lot of different lived experiences. So we normalize and really elevate and talk about the idea that we have to create community across intersectional identities, across values, across beliefs, across religion, across all of these different things, across political belief. We have to. And that's how, and we talk about the algorithms. We talk about like, what does it mean? We watch the Monsters Do on Maple Street, and I think it's sophomore year. And we talk about what is a mob mentality and how easy it is for people to kind of rally with one idea because it's the popular opinion or the louder voice. And so we talk about what it means to take a step back and really think about the different experiences and the different things that are being presented in that moment and not to just go with the loudest opinion. We talk about what it means to be an upstander and what the bystander effect is. Like all of these are conversations. And when we have these conversations, kids are producing TikTok videos and podcasts and other things that are kids speaking to kids about all of these bigger concepts and how they're playing out in their school context. So they're not just learning, but they're also teaching other kids about what they're learning. But that becomes part of the norms and the community in the space. Everything that you're talking about, I didn't get the name of the person who asked the question, I apologize. But everything that we are talking about as adults, I always say like, one of the biggest faults we have in education is we constantly talk to kids. We say, when you grow up. No, these are grown-ups. They're experiencing the world. Now, it's not like when I grew up, my parents, we went home, they closed the door. We didn't interact with the world until the next day when we were back at school again. Today, kids are interacting with the world. It's at their fingertips, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And so we need to talk to kids as we talk to each other. they're capable of having these conversations. They're much more bold. They're much more fearless. They're much more willing to engage with an open mind than many adults that I've worked with, because I do this work with adults and I do it with kids. And when we start to have these conversations with them, like, hey, here's how we bring love back. Here's how we value each other as humans, right? The humanity. How do we bring the humanity back to our profession and to our world? It's that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the humanity of empathy and love and like all of these things that we've kind of lost because schools are factories and we think that we just need to shove skills down kids' throats. And we see that for years, for decades, for centuries now, it's not working, right? Because these concepts mean nothing. I was scrolling through my social media feed and I saw a meme with like, it was a political cartoon, a drawing of an old man dying. And he said, yes, I've managed to not use algebra once in my entire life. And I just laughed because it's like, so much of what we teach, kids don't see why it matters, right? And so like when we're teaching this way, we're able to like set the foundations of love and empathy and understanding and community and all of these like citizenship, all of these huge foundations, but it becomes such a much more meaningful experience. Like I know what kids are learning. They're never going to forget why ethos, pathos, and logos are so important when you're giving a speech or when you're having a conversation with your mom. We're not studying it from the Gettysburg Address. They don't really need to look at how Lincoln used it. They don't care. It's about how can I leverage that skill and use it myself so that it becomes a tool. When I talk to my students, I tell them a period is not the end of a sentence. It's not a punctuation. A period is where you force someone to stop and sit in your words. You have the power as a writer. And we talk about Edgar Allan Poe as a manipulator. Sometimes he didn't give you a name of a character because it wasn't important. He gave you a setting and a context, or he wanted you to be in the psyche of a character. So that's all he gave you. What do you want to give your reader? Where do you want them to sit? Where do you want them to focus? Like think about your power as a writer. And if I'm engaging with your text as a reader, what do you want me to get out of it? What is your voice? What is the most important issue to your pen today? That's what I want you to think about. And when we transform that, all of a sudden, writing isn't something I need to learn so I can get an A. Writing is my lifeline. It's my voice. It's a tool. It's my power to really impact and get my story out and get something that's important to me out. So it's about tying the skills with the intrinsic values that we've lost as a world and showing kids that you can't have one without the other. They're really connected to each other.
Does the work with adults look similar? Because you said you were the department chair or department head. Kenzie Kelly had asked, how do you encourage fellow educators or even your own leadership who may be in some instances uncomfortable to deal with the complexity of diversity when you were in a small collaborative school? Or how have you addressed these same issues with the adults that you work with?
So my department meetings model my classroom. My teachers, the beginning of the year, when they come in, I have a journal for them and a set of pens that I give out to my staff at the beginning of every single year. We journal. There's a prompt at the beginning. Every one of our department meetings, so we have department meetings every Tuesday and every Friday, every other Friday. Every other Friday is literally building community. We don't talk shop at all. We break bread together. We make sure that everybody brings something and we eat breakfast together. And we have one person in our department share their story the first semester. And so it's a different part of their story and it's literally telling their stories and what really shapes them as an educator. I don't give them a prompt. I always tell them you can share the story in whatever mode you like, in whatever way you want, in whatever parts of your story you'd like to share, because again, we need to humanize each other, right? Like whatever, you can't fill from an empty cup. So I always say like, sometimes I'll stand by my department meeting door and I'm like, okay, I'm giving out hugs today. Who needs a hug? Sometimes it's, what are we feeling today? Like, it doesn't have to be school related. Like, how can I support you? How can we support each other? What do you need from this community? Right? We're a community. And it's about like, even in my classroom, sometimes I'm like, hey guys, I know we've had a really heavy week. We're not going to learn for the first 30 minutes of class today. Let's just talk. What's going on? What are people feeling? How is your school day going? What are you struggling with? It doesn't have to be related to my class. Like it's about saying who you are as a human matters enough to me for me to pause and take some time out to really acknowledge your humanity and acknowledge each other and really function as one unit. We are a family. I always tell them like, my locus of control is not this building. There's a lot of things that happen at the higher levels that I have no control over. My locus of control is not what's happening in education as a nation. But when they come into our department office, I want you to feel like this is a home to you. Many of us spend more time with each other than we do with our families. I want you to know that like I'm here to support you as a human, not just as your department chair, How can I support you? How can I feed into what you need today? They can't fill from an empty cup. They can't. If I want them to carry that feeling over to their classrooms, then I need to model that as their department chair in our space as well. And so we have reflection prompts, we have journals. When there's something that's happening that I feel like if I've observed like classes across the board and I feel like there's a trend in something that we need to work on as a department, then I'll bring in an article, we'll read it, we'll annotate it, we'll discuss it in a circle. Our department meetings are in a circle. I'm responsive to what's happening based on walkthroughs. I have two major themes that I kind of come up with, two major goals that I come up with at the end of each year for the following year. And then we have every last Friday of the month, I have a lightning talk with a speaker that's a half hour. And it's targeting, they're like small, manageable, actionable things that teachers can try in their classrooms. And then the following month, I'll go in and I'll do little walkthroughs. And then our second to last department meeting, teachers will come back and talk about their grows and their glows, what worked for them and what didn't, what student products were born out of this practice. And we create these like ideas, like these databases of ideas that are happening in our classrooms every single day for teachers to kind of share ideas with each other. But it's a community of learning, and we've centered that. And it wasn't easy for teachers to get targeted, consistent feedback at the beginning of the year, especially teachers who've been teaching for 20 years and 25 years, and they feel like they've perfected their craft. But one of the things that we center is that we want our students to constantly grow and learn. And so we need to model that in our own practices. And I always tell my teachers, if you haven't taught post-COVID, then there's no way that you know what education looks like today. So a lot of our administrators, I feel like, are so irrelevant sometimes. And a lot of our people who are writing educational policy and teaching college universities, like they talk about things. And half the time, like, you come up to my classroom and show me what that looks like, right? Like, I'd love to see that happen. I also open my classroom to my teachers. And that's another thing too. Like, there's a safety in like, we're a community. You're going to come in. Some days I'm not my best self because I'm human too. And it's about giving each other grace. And that's what I always tell the teachers too. Like, so-and-so does not need to come tell you that they have experienced this trauma, right? We just need to assume that we're living in a very difficult world. I have teachers who come in who are going through divorce, who have sick children, who have sick parents, who are experiencing loss, who are experiencing a bunch of different things. And they often come in and ask for grace. And I'm like, absolutely. But I want us to think about what that looks like for our kids. A lot of our students don't have to put their life on display in order for us to give them grace. And so the same way that we expect grace from each other, let's give our students grace. If you notice that so-and-so is out, let's call that student and say, hey, I missed you from my class. Like, are you okay? Can I do something for you? Or, hey, I've noticed you were off today and you often do your things on time. Do you need an extension? Like, how can I support you to do this extra? Like, take the extra time out. We send postcards home, good postcards. They're never, every week teachers have to call one student and it's a positive call home. And I often encourage them to start with a kid that would probably have never gotten that call, because that's transformative on its own. So it's about that community. And I do the same. I send thank you cards to my teachers. Like every week I'm intentional to put a handwritten card on somebody's desk and just say, hey, I noticed you did this awesome thing in your class today and I really appreciated it. And this is the thing that's going to transform. It's about validating their work. Teachers work hard in a field that doesn't value teaching, where we're also under a microscope all the time. The world is changing, and if we're not changing fast enough to keep up with the world changes, then we're not doing a good job. So it's one of the most stressful jobs out there. And acknowledging, validating, celebrating. We celebrate all the time. Birthdays, marriages, professional accomplishments, degrees, whatever is happening, we'll take the time out in every department meeting to talk about our celebrations, and it's on the agenda. All of those things, just like, again, validating the humanity of my teachers and making them feel seen and understood and saying, you matter enough for me to take this time out of a crazy schedule and a million things we have to discuss, because our district specifically, they have about 350 initiatives happening at the same time all the time. And so there's always so much that we have to do. And it's part of that is also saying, hey guys, here's what we're supposed to be working on, but I'm going to put that to the side because I feel like this matters more right now. It's about those things, and about like also being a leader enough to decide what the most important thing is that we're going to be pushing that's going to have the largest impact, but also validate and humanize my teachers the same way I want them to validate and humanize their students.
And perhaps the last one, just kind of given where we're at with time, I'll ask a question from Kina. about, and maybe you could answer this personally for yourself, because it sounds like you've answered it structurally, the practices you engage with the staff, but how do you protect yourself in this work from the dangers of burning out? Kina asks, the work is necessary and a passion for the cause can take us far, but we all have our limits. How do you maintain a full cup without burning out?
You know, I think I've said it a million times. I'm Palestinian. I today I feel like more than ever, this work is so personal to me in so many ways because my identity has been under attack my entire life. My identity has been absolutely erased from school curriculum. So much of what fuels me is that identity. It's the experience of getting people to really feel like when I became a teacher, one of the things that I said to myself is like, I want every kid to feel like, who they are is, like so valid. Like who you are is valid. Who you are is valuable and valid. And you should really like, I feel like I never came into my own until I was like in my late 30s, because all throughout college, all throughout, like even my doctoral dissertation, my methodologist was anti-Palestinian and was so upset. Like when I started my doctoral dissertation, my topic was the perceptions of inclusion of Arab American students in historically homogenous school districts. I live in Illinois, in the largest Arab population in the country. There was a 600% growth of Arabs because of a lot of different things that were happening in the years that I lived here. And so I worked in a district where all of a sudden, like in 2 years, we had a massive population of Arab students because a mosque opened up in the area. And so little had changed. And because Arabs weren't on the census, there was no conversation about like how to shift our practice or to shift our school environment to include these new students that were coming into our district. And so that got me thinking about like, what's their experience? Like, what are the kids experiencing? What are they thinking? And I'm in the largest Palestinian community in the country. So my sample ended up being a Palestinian student sample, not by design, but by default. And I was so happy because there's nothing in research in academia that targets Palestinian students. But she was so upset that my dissertation took a year longer because she did everything in her power to try to get me to focus on students that were from marginalized communities versus focusing on Palestinian students. And so like every step of my career has been defined by my Palestinian identity in one way or another. And so to me, it's very personal. And that really drives me. Like I talk about my ancestors a lot because I come from an ancestry of freedom fighters. My grandfather's turning 91 next month. He grew up in my life. He actually I recall him kind of gathering he has 135 grandkids and great grandkids, and he would gather all of his grandkids around him when we were younger and feed us with his hands and tell us stories about like education is liberation. You have to fight for justice for all people. Like these were things that were planted in us from very young ages. And so it's very personal to me. What motivates me and what keeps my cup full is I keep thinking about the number of challenges that my three kids experienced in the world and how difficult it was for them to really hold true to just who they are and feel comfortable, like really just showing up as their full authentic selves in a lot of spaces, and how important it is, how much more difficult the world has become since my kids. My kids are 26, 22, and 17. And so the world has just become so much more violent since my oldest and my middle child were in school. How are their kids going to experience this world? And so I have a very strong PLT. I know Abid is in here. Abid is doing sessions. Abid is a part of that PLT. Chris and Nick are going to be a part of that PLT as an organization, as people. Like it's about finding your people and being able to say, hey, I'm having a rough day, and picking each other up. And it's about also recognizing that sometimes you need to take a step back and just do a little bit of TLC. You're not running on full all the time. You're not running, this work will continue. And it's about also mobilizing the people around you. It's mobilizing the students. It fills my cup to see kids, the messages that we get all the time from students who are going out and doing this work, the messages from teachers who come in and say, this is the first time I feel like I've been in the district for 20 plus years, and this is the first time that I feel like somebody actually sees me as a human. That is what keeps me going. That is what, like, at the end of the day, on the worst day, those messages, and I have like a love board in my office where I keep all these messages that I get that are written in the email, that I like cut them out and I put them there. And on my rough days, I just like look at those. There are some days where I go into my office and I close my door and I'm like, I need to give myself grace today. I just need a quiet day. I'm going to sit in my office and do the logistical part of my job, which also doesn't go away. And I'm going to close my door and I'm just going to make sure I recharge today so that I can come back tomorrow as my best self again. I'm human, right? Like there are bad days. There are days where I feel like I'm burnt out, but I allow myself to feel those things because I am human and I recognize my own humanity, but I won't let myself sit there. I will not allow myself to stay there. So it's about supporting myself with an army of people who are able to like really pull me out of my dark spots when I need it, who I can talk through it. It's about making sure that I'm physically going to the gym. I go to the gym every day or at least 5 times a week. And I let out a lot of my stress in the gym. It's about like making sure that I am immersing myself with people that I love and who love me back. It's about giving myself grace and time to disconnect if I need to. I'll take a mental health day and stay home from school if I need to. That is something that I think that with all of the work that we do, we have to give ourselves that grace also. So it's about recognizing and being able to name that it's time for me to walk away, because if I don't, then I'm not my best self in that space and I'm not serving anyone. And there's a lot of lives who need me to be healthy. My home, my parents, my kids, and then my teachers, and then my students that are all, it's an umbrella, right? Like I impact all those people. So I need to make sure that I am mentally, emotionally, physically healthy so that I can continue to serve at the capacity that I serve. And whatever that requires in the moment, it looks different sometimes. Sometimes it's about just that quiet hour in the morning where I close my door and I kind of get myself in a good headspace that I could go in for the next 7 hours and be the servant that I need to be in the space. So I'm not afraid to say, hey guys, I'm having a rough day today. Again, the transparency is key and I communicate with my team. We have a Google chat. I'm having a rough day today. I just need an hour to recharge. Please give me that grace. If there's an emergency, I'm here, but I need this hour. My team understands, right? And they will ask for the same. Like I always offer them, hey guys, if there's anything and you need me to walk in and teach your class today, I'm ready to do that. Like you let me know. We're a team. We support each other, right? And so it's about me being a part of that team and asking for help when I need it as well.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Sawsan Jaber. Um, Please, folks, if you could just join me in thanking for this time, for the exceptional keynote. And just remember, too, that we can actually keep the conversation going in the Discord if there are questions that burning questions that need to get answered. I saw that she's actually in there, so perhaps she could answer those as well. And I just wanted to touch on before we get out of here, just to thank the sponsors for our event real quick. Our transcription partner Cortico uses the Fora app to facilitate small group conversations, combining AI and human listening to help organizations understand and utilize these discussions for public dialogue and decision making. The Minor Collective, where Cass and Cornelius have landed in the Discord as well last night. That was great to see. A community movement to reimagine school. Their Thought Sanctuary, which you can actually join in the Discord tomorrow and Thursday from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, will be a curated space for educators to joyfully and safely generate practical dream-based ideas. And of course, the STEMpunks. The STEMpunks Foundation is a close collaborator with HRP, and they're dedicated to creating an inclusive world for neurodivergent and disabled individuals, using their innovative approach to drive change in public perception and policy. And kind of with that, just previewing the rest of the day that we have ahead of us as well. We've got a little bit of a break. It's the longest break that we've had at the conference so far, ahead of the joined session that'll actually be between Trevor and Abir's tracks, which will be an incredible way to bring those two groups together. It's a wonderful experiment that we haven't tried before, so I appreciate y'all coming along with that. And then, of course, this afternoon, Talkin' Mastery Transcript with Patricia Russell and Carl Farrington, getting a Nova Lab tour with Gareth and his students. That'll be great. And actually learning from Pam Moran and Ira Sokol later this afternoon. And of course, sometime this afternoon, we'll release Dr. Carla Shalaby's video keynote as well ahead of her Q&A tomorrow. So we're just going to keep on rolling here. And thank you again so much, Dr. Sawsan Jaber, for joining us this morning.
Nick, shameless plug, but there is going to be a part 2 to street data that is focused on student agency and voice.
Okay.
And I'm working on that with Shane Saphir and two other teacher authors. And it is we're writing our last chapter as we speak, and it's going to be amazing. So look for that. It should be coming out mid this year, hopefully. And a lot of these practices and student voices and questions and like a lot of this stuff is captured into that text. And so look for the book. It's going to be a great resource. I'm really excited for that. And there's going to be a ton of stuff online too to support teachers who are doing this work by the collective of the teachers and the people who are writing the book. And so I'm excited for that.
Oh, brilliant. We'll have to look for that. So thank you so much, all. We'll see you in about an hour for that joint session. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.